So thanks for inviting me, Dietz. I arrived at Georgia Tech around 2020, and coming to CMBC has been one of the highlights of my time so far in Atlanta. The community here is great. Reminds me of other places I've been. So Georgia Tech is great too, but I like the DNA in the air here at Emory. So I want to talk about the traveling salesperson problem, which is a problem in theoretical computer science. But really what I really want to do is sketch my approach to research. And this is maybe more for the grad students here. So I want to talk about how you find problems, how I found this problem. Sometimes these are random kind of events. And why this is an interesting problem for both computer science and for cognitive science, although less well studied there. And then I want to walk you through a series of studies, mostly empirical, that my lab has conducted over several years to try to get our fingers on this problem, get our heads around this problem. So it's an evolving story, and that's part of the point. I don't want to just kind of cut to the finish line. So I first encountered this problem, I guess, as an undergraduate, but the interesting fact that humans are efficient at this problem was not something that I encountered until 2011, where I was invited to a seminar in Dogstall, which is where computer scientists go and hang out for a week and talk about a problem. And I was invited because I studied problem solving and try to model how that works in the brain. And so, there I am with a bunch of computer scientists that study problem solving. And I was introduced to the traveling salesperson problem as a topic for cognitive science by Zig Pislow and Iris Van Rouge, who had been noticing or had been part of this literature that showed that a problem which is hard for computers is actually kind of easy for humans. And why is that the case? And I filed that away. And then 3 years later, as is tradition, I sort of organized one of these seminars, and it was roughly on the same topic, and the conversations continued. And at this point, I thought I might take up this problem, but really what I did was I spent some time thinking about other ideas that came out of this conference. Hanging around with theoretical computer scientists, I started getting interested in how people reason about proofs. But in 2019, I came back to this problem. Usually I would run a math cognition seminar at University of Minnesota where I was before, and I thought, let me mix it up and do a seminar on computational thinking. And 1 week or over a couple of weeks, we read these papers about how humans are good at problems that are hard for computers. And I had a very talented group of people around me, a postdoc, Jeff Bai, and some grad students you could see from various disciplines. And they, for their kind of projects in this class, took on the TSP. And their intuition was there's something about clustering, how humans can cluster displays that allows them to get a leg up on this problem. And so we did some class projects, and they were interesting, and they might have died, but that fall, a graduate student, a very talented graduate student, joined my lab, Vijay Marapudi. He's now a postdoc at Berkeley, and he took on the task of like really taking our ideas and making them solid and extending them. And so for the next 3 years, this little team, partially in Minnesota and partially in Georgia Tech, we ran studies, we wrote papers for the Cognitive Science Conference, and systematically chipped away at this problem. And we thought, okay, now it's time to write this up. And I can't tell you how rich this group of students were and their ideas they came up with. One of the spin-off projects was a project on, well, how actually do people do visual clustering themselves? If we think that clustering is important for TSP, we have to understand that process. And there wasn't a large literature. So that led to a paper that just got published in Psych Review. So lots of good ideas came out of it. So this talk, CMBC talk, I've given this talk once in the fall, is an attempt for me to kind of put this story together and write like a long paper that summarizes our work. And so I want to present that argument as I understand it. I've written up the introduction, but I really want your feedback on the story because it's going to impact how I write this up. Okay, so I'm going to spend more time than usual on the introduction because I want to invite you into this problem and let you feel like why it's a problem to get hooked on, and then how others and how we have been thinking about it before I get to the experiments, which will be good for you who are not in the psychological sciences because the experiments might be a little tedious, but this part should be the fun part. And let me start with graph algorithms, or the kinds of algorithms that computer scientists care about. If you take an introductory class in algorithms, this might very well be the book you use, but any book is going to have the same distribution of topics. And about 1/6 of the topics in a typical algorithms book are about graphs, how to solve problems defined on graphs. It's a big part of theoretical computer science. And maybe first among the problems in graph theory that everyone knows about is the traveling salesperson problem. So this is an important problem for undergraduates or graduate students to get their heads around in theoretical computer science and for computer scientists to solve. So what is the TSP? So in the TSP, we have a graph. A graph is a set of vertices, what we might call units or nodes, and they're fully connected. You can go from any vertex to any other vertex, but each path has a certain associated cost. You can think about this as cities that can be traversed via roads, and there's a certain distance to every road. Okay? And the goal of solving a TSP problem is to produce a tour. A tour starts at one vertex, visits all other vertices exactly once, and comes back to the original vertex to produce a tour that's of minimum length. Of all the possible ways you could traverse this set of cities, what's the minimum length way? So the TSP is a problem in computer science, a class of things. Any particular example or instance is a graph. So this is a particular instance of the TSP. Now there's lots of properties of an instance. I'm going to focus on one, the most important one, which is the size denoted by the number of vertices. So there's whatever, how many, like 8 vertices here. That's going to be the interesting property of this problem I'm going to focus on. Now this problem might seem esoteric, but it is a fundamental problem in a lot of industries. So for example, think about FedEx. Every day they're solving this problem to send their trucks out on the routes which minimize time or gas used by their drivers. And to get a little better solution means saving a lot of money. But all kinds of applications are there for this algorithm, and then more generally for what's called combinatorial optimization. So laying out wires on a chip so you minimize wire length, things like that. They're all in the same class of problems, broadly speaking. Is it an easy problem to solve? Maybe that prior one was. Here's a tour connecting all the capital cities of states in the lower 48 of the US, plus Washington, D.C. Seems like maybe if I showed you these dots, you could find this route, but in fact, it's not an easy problem. It's quite hard. So for a problem that has n vertices, there's n minus 1 factorial divided by 2 possible tours. And you've got to find the optimal or an optimal tour in that huge space. So this is a hard, difficult problem. You could see that even for 10 vertices. There's 181,000 odd tours that are possible if you have 10 vertices. And if you just add one more city, make it 11, you increase that number by a factor of 10. So the complexity of this problem explodes as the size of the problem increases. Okay? So thus, even for a medium-sized problem, I don't know, like 4,000 vertices, it's very, very difficult for computers to solve these optimally, to find the true minimum length solution. In fact, it's even worse than that. TSP belongs to a class of problems in theoretical computer science that are called NP-hard problems. And to kind of cut through a lot of math, we don't have any efficient way to solve such problems. Efficient means, given the size of the problem, an algorithm that can get the optimal solution in time that's a polynomial function of the size of the problem. We don't have that for this problem. In fact, there's good reasons to believe that such algorithms might not be possible. It's an open problem in computer science. It's called the P versus NP problem. It's on a list of the most important problems in all of mathematics. If you solve one of these problems, you get $1 million. That's how important it is. So what do computer scientists do in the face of this intractability? They still have to make progress on this problem because we need these algorithms. And so what they do is they sacrifice getting the optimal problem, the optimal solution, to get an approximately correct solution. They develop techniques that give us close to optimal tours, even if they're not optimal, and we're satisfied with that. So this is how computer scientists think of this problem. And I'm going to return to this algorithmic point a little at the very end of the talk. But I want to talk about this fascinating finding about humans. So given how difficult this problem is, it's been known now for 20 years or so that humans are relatively efficient when solving relatively small instances. So they can produce tours that were within 10% of the minimum length. In time, linear in the size of the problem. You add another city to the tour, they don't blow up. They just take an extra increment of time for problems that are sufficiently small. Let's say 120 points or more. So in this regime of small problems, people are incredibly efficient. So how do they do this when computers struggle for the full-blown problem? Let me show you what the data look like. So this is data from Zig Pislow's lab. On the x-axis is the number of cities in a problem, and on the y-axis is the goodness of the solution. So take the tour a person produces and divide it by the minimum length. So 1 would be the perfect tour if the person provided it. This would be tours that are 3% above optimal. That's how to read this graph. So here's the performance of 6 individuals in this study. So you see that all 6 are within 10% of optimal, even as the number of points are increasing. That's what I mean by saying that people can generate approximately correct solutions. And then I said in time linear. So again, x-axis the size of the problem, the number of points, and y-axis is the time it takes them to connect the next city. So take the total time to solve a problem, divide it by the number of cities, and you have the time per city, right? So this would be a person that takes about 3 seconds per city to connect it into the solution. And you see people are linear. They just take a constant amount of time. As you increase the number of points, it's not like they start blowing up. So this is the kind of data to explain. How do people do this? Okay. And there's, generally speaking, 3 classes of theories out there in the literature. It's not a huge literature. And I want to walk through these 3 theories. For that third one, there's a kind of a set of proposals. I'll show you what I think is the most elegant of them to give you a sense of, yes?
Right. Does it matter if the people are allowed to use tools, like they use a pencil and paper versus does that change the results of the study?
No, it's been done both ways, paper and pencil, or actually just clicking on a computer screen. Those are the 2 ways it's been done. There's maybe a navigation in a room question you're thinking about. Maybe we return it at the end of the talk, but basically people have done that kind of study with animals. It turns out animals show some of the same optimalities for smaller problems, just as if it's made a navigation problem. Yep. Okay, so first strategy, the convex hull strategy. So assume that your vision's magical, some large part of your cortex does vision, so assume that vision can give you the convex hull of that point array, which is basically the outer perimeter of points, okay? So here's a strategy. Get the convex hull, and then walk the convex hull points in sequence, and every time you see an interior point, go in, dip in and grab it, insert it into your tour. So let me show you that. So let's say this is a problem, there's a tour. How might a person have generated this? They might have looked at those points and said, here's the convex hull, here's the outer perimeter, let me walk this, and every once in a while when I'm close to an interior point, just grab it. Those are the interior points. Now, if this proposal is true, it should be the case that the greater the number of interior points in a problem, the more ambiguity there is, right? The more you have to think about when do I dip in, and maybe you're not going to dip in at the optimal time, and so performance should get worse. That was the first proposal on the table. So in this study, the first such study really, all the problems had 20 points, and that's the number of points that are not on the convex hull, the number of points that are interior. And that's the percent above optimal of people on those problems. And you see that people don't seem to be really getting worse as the number of interior points increases. They're roughly in the same performance level. So these data, which were taken at the time to be maybe supportive of this convex hull hypothesis, I don't think really strongly are. But I'm not here to beat up on the convex hull hypothesis, but this is the kind of one proposal that's on the table and the way you might get data for it. Another proposal is more of a heuristic than a strategy. And this idea is this: as you're incrementally building your tour, connecting cities, avoid adding an edge if it crosses an existing edge. And this is actually licensed by a set of theorems in graph theory that basically say the optimal tour has no crossing edges, okay? And if you walk the points, if you avoid crossing edges in your tour, you'll tend to follow the convex hull. In other words, as a consequence of avoiding crossing edges, you get behavior that looks like it's following the convex hull, but it's a consequence, it's not actually the strategy. So the way to think about it is this. So here's a tour, it's got a crossing edge. Anytime you see a crossing edge, you can always do a bit of local surgery and get a shorter tour. And so the proposal here is that people are somehow intuit this heuristic, and so avoid such crosses. And when this was first proposed, Iris van Rouge went back through the data that existed at the time, got the data, and looked at how often people produce crosses in their tours across a bunch of studies. And she found only about 6% of the time do they actually produce a cross, which, either they're getting lucky or they're actually actively avoiding crosses. That was her proposal. So we have 2 proposals on the table at this point, and then Vickers and Lee did a great study where they tried to pit these against each other. So they generated instances of 40 dots, just randomly generated tens of thousands of these instances. And then they looked for instances, they sampled instances that had these properties. So what you see on the y-axis is the percentage, the number of the 40 dots that are on the convex hull. And they looked at sets of problems that had a relatively large number on the convex hull and relatively small number. And on this x-axis, they looked at the number of possible edges that actually cross in the problems. So orthogonally, you see some problems have relatively few crossing edges and some have relatively many. And the hypothesis was this: if people follow the convex hull, they should find those stimuli in those green dots easier. And if you follow the crossing avoidance heuristic, you should actually find the stimuli that are over here easiest. And the reason why is because if there are a lot of crosses, once you commit to one edge, you can rule out all the edges that cross it, right? So you can rule out more possible edges along the way. The logic's a little trickier, but it goes through if you think about it. What they found was not evidence for the convex hull hypothesis. That's the problems that actually had a lot of their nodes on the convex hull, people had way above optimal tours. It was actually the number of intersections that drove the behavior. If there were a lot of intersections, people were more efficient because, again, any new edge they added ruled out a bunch of possible edges. Okay, one more. I could see you're getting a little bit glassy-eyed about these strategies. Let me tell you about one more.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't actually understand, like, two main effects.
Yeah, but the one for convex hull goes in the wrong direction. Right, so yeah, this should have been the better one, closer to optimal. A large number of points on the convex hull.
Oh, the number of points that were on the hull,
Yeah.
on the hull, not just total number.
That's right. It's always 40 points total. Yeah, sorry, I should have been clear about that. Yeah. So the last of these strategies is one of strategies that are vaguely about clustering. So I want to present this one. It's the most explicitly about clustering because in some ways our proposal builds on this. So this proposal is this. You have a stimulus. Use some kind of visual clustering approach to break this up into a smaller set of clusters. So if there are endpoints, what Kong and Shun propose is you try to find 2 to the square root of n. So if there's, I don't know, if there's 36 points here, you find 2 times 6, so 12 clusters of points. Doesn't really matter the number, but you try to break this up into a smaller number of clusters. Every cluster has a central point, the centroid of that cluster. So find that. So now you have a smaller number of central points. Then use a spline to connect those in a line. Connect all those points into a continuous curve. Okay. Now project all the points to that curve in the original stimulus. Okay, you've got that curve that connects the centroids. And then connect those, walk your spline and connect those points in order. It's a lot going on here. And so there's not any particularly strong evidence for this, but this has got the right insight, which is take a complex problem and use clustering to break it up. And so that's the insight that my students had independently had. And so I want to kind of walk through why clustering, besides that model proposal, might be important here. And so it had been noticed early on that people had an easier time with clustered stimuli than random stimuli. Although this was actually a study, I believe, in geography that had looked at the TSP in geography. And they gave people problems that had 6, 10, and 18 points, but they varied whether they were randomly distributed, that's the distributed condition, or whether they'd been generated by ground truth clusters. Positive clusters here, and then put some Gaussian points around it. And they found that people had closer to optimal solutions for the clustered stimuli than the random ones. And that is subtle evidence that people can see the cluster structure and exploit it. But we can be more precise here. And so to be more precise, I want to go back to algorithms and talk about a general approach to thinking about the design of algorithms that have a particular structure. And that's called divide and conquer, which when you have a problem that's got a recursive structure, this is a general strategy for solving such problems. So in divide and conquer in general, here's how you think about it. If you have a problem and you can decompose it into a set of smaller problems, each one which is an instance of the larger problem, then you do that, you solve each of the smaller instances because they're smaller, they're easier to solve, and then you somehow combine the local solutions into a global solution. This is the general strategy, divide and conquer. It works for all kinds of areas of computer science, like optimally multiplying matrices. All these abstract problems have this kind of solution. And so maybe what humans are doing is using divide and conquer and the properties of their visual system to solve TSPs efficiently. Okay. So here's a divide and conquer strategy for TSP. You get a bunch of points, use visual clustering to break it up into a set of clusters of points, treat each cluster as a local TSP problem, solve that, and then do some surgery to combine each of those local tours into a global tour. So that's the proposal that we have on the table, okay? So is this actually a smart thing to do? Like, does this actually get you a more efficient problem-solving process than just, I don't know, trying to enumerate all the tours? Yeah.
It would seem to me that one of the things this is predicated on, that people are able to accurately to enable more when they
Right.
that how fundamental is that?
Yeah.
Does that happen?
Yeah. That's a fundamental assumption of the approach we're going to take, and experiment 0 is going to show you evidence that's the case. We have to establish that before we even get to the rest of it. So you're ahead of me.
I wonder if this one we need to establish, or if it's just we're going to capture the fact that problem instances decomposable. Appreciate that. The solutions of the problem is it guaranteed that they're composable? Same sort of.
Yeah. Or if you decompose it, is it once you have local solutions, will there be a lot of error introduced in trying to put them together? Yeah, I don't know of any guarantee on that. Yeah, so yeah, it's an empirical question. So let me give you a sense of why this is a smart thing to do. So let's take a case where there's 25 points in a problem. So I showed you that factorial formula earlier for how many possible tours there are. So there's basically Avogadro's number worth of possible tours for this problem. Okay. So let's take the strategy. So the strategy is first form visual clusters. Let me just say without loss of generality that we take square root of number of points visual clusters. There's a nice balancing property here because now we're going to have 5 clusters each of about 5 points. So let's just pick that. So we choose to cluster. For each of those clusters, we take that n-1 factorial divided by 2 formula. There's 12 possible tours for each of those 5-point clusters. Okay. Once we have the local tours, we need to visit each of the local tours in some order. So that's essentially a TSP at a global level. So there's 12 possible tours of the clusters. Okay. You have a little local surgery. Once you try to visit a cluster, you've got to decide which vertex you're going to join. And then as you exit it, it could either be one of the 2 it's connected to. So there's a little combinatorics here. So there's 10 ways to make the local surgery decision for each tour you join. So if you do the multiplication of all this, you get a still awful number, but it's 10 to the 12, like small, by a factor of 10 to the 12 better than the original number. So there's an efficiency here. Obviously humans can't search as many tours as well. Okay, so let's get to the data for this kind of proposal. And as you said, the first place we want to start is to show that visual clustering is actually a stable ability that people can use. It's not just some ad hoc procedure that you try. So is there something stable about visual clustering? And so here's how we operationalize that. We asked, if I give you the same dot cloud on 2 different occasions and say, draw the clusters you see. We don't tell you how many clusters. Do you produce the same clusterings? So if so, that indicates that you have a stable strategy or a stable ability there. If not, then we're going to be in trouble. So in this study, we had 47 undergrads. We varied how many points were in the stimulus, and we varied whether the points were statistically clustered or dispersed. So there's a problem with prior studies. When they wanted to have clustered stimuli, they would posit ground truth clusters and put some Gaussian noise around them. And I don't think that's the right way to go, because once you build that structure in, you might turn this into an induction task for people to find the cluster structure that you built in. So what we did was we generated random stimuli, and there's statistical measures of spatial randomness. So the ones which met that criterion, we called dispersed, and the ones which failed to be statistically random, we put in the clustered pile. So I think this is a more neutral way to define. So here's what this looks like. For the case of 20 points, the one on the bottom is statistically random, and the one on the top is statistically not random. So this is a much more subtle manipulation. We're not like blaring out to people there's cluster structure here to take advantage of. And across all the sort of 7 numbers of points times the cluster versus dispersed, here's what stimuli look like. So I think this is a subtle manipulation. So people clustered each stimulus on 2 occasions. In between, they performed a distractor task so that they couldn't really memorize it. And this was a variable in all of our analyses. Sorry, I should say, for half the stimuli, the second time you saw it, we mirror imaged it. We reversed it vertically and horizontally to see if this reduced your reliability, but it didn't have any effect, so I'm not going to talk about that variable anymore. So here's what it feels like to be in the experiment. So I'm going to show to you both, first, the same stimulus, both in clustering mode and then TSP mode, which we're going to talk about in a second. But if you're in clustering mode, this is an early version of it. You would get a stimulus like this, and you just simply draw the clusters you see. We wouldn't tell you how many there were. We wouldn't tell you anything. Just whatever your visual system sees as clusters, go ahead and draw that. Okay? And then later on, in the experiments I show you, in TSP mode, you just simply connect this into a tour. So it's the most natural thing you can ask subjects to do. Okay. Okay, so there's a little bit of a technical question. We're gonna give everybody the same stimulus twice. We have to have a way to compute or measure how similar their clusterings are. So it turns out this is a problem that there's various solutions to in spatial statistics. So Fox-Mello, you might have heard of the RAND index. These are 2 ways to quantify how similar 2 cluster solutions are to a stimulus. We used Fox-Mello for reasons that don't matter. The important takeaway is this. This value ranges from 1 to 0 for any pair of clusterings. 1 means they're identical. If 2 points are in the same cluster in one stimulus, they're always in the same cluster in the other stimulus. 0 means they're completely not identical, and it ranges between here, right? So do people produce roughly similar clusterings? This is just data to show you the kinds of clusterings they produce. So, that seems a sensible clustering this subject produced for this stimulus. There's a kind of cluster order here. That's why the number's there, but you can ignore that. The same exact stimulus, here's a different clustering that another subject produced. So it's not like you're kind of compelled to produce one clustering. It's a bit non-obvious what the right clustering is. So if people actually produce similar clusterings on 2 occasions, that would be evidence for stability. So here's what the data look like. So number of points in a stimulus, and that's the value of Fox-Mallows, and again, 1 is the optimal score. So for the stimuli that statistically had cluster structure in them, that were not random, we see the Fox-Mellows values, the similarity of the 2 clusterings, is about 0.8. Decreases slightly as the number of points increases, but it's closer to 1 than, let's say, 0. It's a bit lower for dispersed, but in general, these Fox-Mellow scores are, positive and heading towards 1. There's not like a baseline here for what counts as good, but I take this as soft evidence at least that visual clustering is a stable ability in people. You're likely to produce a similar clustering on 2 occasions, presumably because you use similar strategies. And it's also somewhat sensitive to the cluster structure of the stimulus. It's not, yeah. Yeah. No, not at all. No, I like your questions.
2 questions. One, so they're comparing the true clustering with the.
No, this is a person with their own clustering. Yeah. Later on, though, I'll show you a control like that in a simulation.
Okay, so I'll if this one. Go back to the equation. Here, if you're multiplying together those 2 terms.
Yeah.
Didn't make any sense. So here they're equally weighted.
Yeah.
By the true as possible.
Yeah.
It's too late.
In the standard metric now, I guess maybe this guarantees something between 0 and 1. I don't know the mathematical justification for this formula. Yeah. You're concerned that this is maybe biasing the results in some way?
I just wondered whether.
We got similar results when we use another index to measure the random index.
I
Yeah.
just wonder, like, solvents.
Yeah.
They give people rate. False positives.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind, if you're a person, you do the clustering on one occasion, and then 20 minutes later, you see a stimulus and you do it again. So it's not like you're doing some analytic strategy, right? And in fact, we don't have any evidence that people remembered they were the same stimuli as they saw before. Yeah. Yeah, Robert.
So if I understood correctly though, see the first time, cluster first, and then they solve the.
Oh no, I didn't mean to. No, they cluster in this experiment. They cluster twice. That I was just flashing ahead to show you the TSP interface. But imagine they do the clustering thing twice.
I was just wondering if the clustering process itself requires them in a way to solve.
When we get to that experiment where they do one cluster on the same stimulus, they do both TSP and clustering. We counterbalance that, and we didn't see an effect of that. Yeah.
I was just thinking the measurement was for like geometric distance in a map. That'd be something logical, technical.
Yeah, there's non-Euclidean versions of the TSP, and this is planar TSP in 2D. The TSP generalizes to multiple dimensions. Even the simplest case of Euclidean TSP, where the distances are the actual distances, is NP hard.
As a follow-up to that, do humans still have a benefit over machines for the non-Euclidean? Or do we have a special benefit only in the topological?
So there's one study of non-Euclidean TSP, and it suggests that people essentially do some dimensionality reduction to turn it into something like Euclidean TSP. Imagine doing a TSP in the real world where half the cities are at the top of a mountain and half are at the base of the mountain. So people have a special strategy for those kinds of cases. But we could talk afterwards about that. Not my studies, Zig Pislow. Okay, so now that we know that clustering is something like a stable ability, before I get to the punchline, I've got to show you that TSP problem solving is also stable. What if you generate different solutions on different occasions? It wouldn't really make sense to say that you use clustering and that's what structures your TSP, right? So there's only like one mediocre study of TSP stability. So we did the same thing. You see the same stimulus on two occasions. You give a TSP on both occasions. We want to show that your TSPs are similar. Your solutions are similar. So number of points, it's got very much the same structure. We varied the number of points and whether the problems themselves statistically had cluster structure or not. So here's examples of the stimuli in the space. And you're gonna see each stimulus on two different occasions and give us a TSP solution, a tour for each stimulus, okay? How do we measure how similar two tours are? Well, now it's actually pretty straightforward, right? Two tours each tour has a set of edges in it, right? A set of n edges in it. So just compare what fraction of the edges are the same in the two tours. That's a measure of how similar the tours are. If they have the exact same tour, that ratio is going to be 1. If they're completely disjoint tours, they share no edges, it's going to be 0, right? So here, for the clustered stimuli, here's the overlap in the tours. The number of proportion of shared edges is a function of the number of points. So you see about 75% of the edges are shared in people's two tours for the same stimulus. And it's not really being pushed around by the size of the stimulus, right? It is pushed around a little bit. You see the overlap in tours is decreasing. So for the hardest case, 25 cities with random, no structure, so it's random. You see now we're getting about 2/3 overlap in the tours. But I want to remind you that, remember that math I showed you? There's a really huge number of possible tours that are for this problem. People are producing two tours that overlap on 2/3 of their edges. That's still pretty good evidence of stability in their strategies.
Except that a human would see that, right? No human would get in there and go, oh, this is one of the hypothetical possibilities.
Yeah.
So both in this and in the clustering, did you ever randomly shuffle the sessions so that you pair one participant's first with another participant's second, just to see what is the baseline in general? This is could you get up to that many? Maybe it's like 0.5,
Yeah.
or maybe it's pretty close to what you're seeing.
We didn't do that analysis, but we did an analysis where we compare people's tours to the optimal TSP. So it's not quite the same thing, but I think it's going to start getting at the question you're asking. But we'll save that to experiment 3 if we get to it. I'm not sure we're going to get to it, in which case we'll have to talk about it offline afterwards. Okay, given that we have our set of stimuli, we want to see if we reproduce the standard finding, which is that people are pretty close to optimal in their tours for these small problems. And you see that for the clustered stimuli, people are within 10% of optimal in the length of their tours. It's there for the dispersed stimuli as well. So there's no interaction here either. So our stimuli seem to be functional like everybody else's stimuli. So people seem to be stable and they're showing the same strong performance. And they're also relatively linear in their time. As you add more cities, the total time they take to solve the problem increases linearly. It doesn't increase, it doesn't blow up. So we're seeing the same kinds of performance effects with our stimuli. The last thing I'll show you is some evidence for the crossing avoidance heuristic in an individual differences measure. So crossing avoidance, again, is people should avoid putting crosses in their tours because that leads to less efficient tours. You can ask this in a different way, which is it the case that the people that produce more optimal tours are better at avoiding crosses, and the people that produce less optimal, worse tours, do so because they let crosses slip into their tours? So this point would be an individual that has a relatively low proportion of crosses in their tours, and also was pretty close to optimal. It was only like 4% above optimal. So it seems like the crossing avoidance people will be committed to this being kind of a line. The worse you are at one, the worse you should be at the other. And in fact, that's strikingly the case. That people who are produce bad tours that are quite high above optimal are also the ones that tend to include more crosses. Nothing causal here. This is just a correlational observation, just to kind of round out that story I told you earlier. Okay, so I think we have evidence that TSP problem solving is relatively stable. I want to move on to the question that really is at the heart of this talk, which is there a relationship between clustering and TSP problem solving? Okay, so this is our claim that people use divide and conquer. And if this is the case, what we should see, if we have you have a stimulus and draw clusters, and on another occasion do your TSP tour should honor the cluster structure that you as a participant see in that stimulus. Right? So we want to see if there's congruence. So to do this, we had 67 subjects. They solved tours and clustered stimuli that varied in the same 2 dimensions you're seeing. Number of points, and whether statistically there was cluster structure there or not. So like on one part of the experiment, you might do the TSP tour of a stimulus, and then later on you might see the stimulus and it might be flipped this way and flipped this way, and you might draw cluster structure. That's what it's going to feel like if you're a subject in the experiment. How do we measure the alignment between someone's tour and their cluster structure, their clusters? You can basically, this formula operationalizes this intuition. Here, let me show you I'll just show you the intuition. So here is for a given participant, the stimulus, and you see the clusters they saw, and you see the tour they draw. And what you notice is when a participant enters a cluster that they saw, they finish the cluster. They completely connect all the points before they exit and go to a new cluster. So we developed a measure, which is cluster deviance, which basically, how often did you leave a cluster and then rejoin it a second time? Okay, the more you do that, the less you're following the cluster structure, right, as you bounce around in your tour. So here we see perfect deviance. That's what the zero deviance, perfect congruence. Here's another example, a more complex stimulus, a more complex set of clusters. And you see again, though, the subject never enters a cluster without finishing it off before they go to another cluster. Again, their own cluster structure, their own tour. Here's some deviance. So now the person saw that central cluster, but when they did their tour, they entered it, but then they exited before finishing it and did other parts of the problem before they re-entered that. So now the deviance is a little bit above 0. And here's kind of a really bad example where they enter the central cluster, they exit, they enter it again later on, they exit it, and they re-enter it a third time. So the more they deviate from that cluster structure, the larger that deviation score goes. It ranges between 0 and 1, with 0 being no deviation and 1 being just a lot of deviation. So do people show really low, very low deviations in their TSP tours from their cluster structures? Well, in fact, they were incredibly good, like much better than I ever would have guessed. So instead, I'm going to show you a different metric, which is perfect congruence. What proportion of the time did people generate tours which were perfectly congruent with their cluster structure? So for the clustered stimuli, more than half the tours that people generated were perfectly congruent with their cluster structure they saw in the same stimulus. Never exited a cluster prematurely during the tour. And even for the dispersed stimuli, they were, close to equiprobable in producing perfectly congruent tours to their cluster structure. Those are frequency counts. Overall, 52% of their tours perfectly followed their cluster structure they saw in their data. So when the student first showed me this, I was like, there's probably some error, go back and check. We never expected this level of congruence. This is overall. You can ask about as a function of the two factors. So here's the proportion of trials that were perfectly congruent as the number of points increases for the clustered stimuli. So you see they never really get below 50%. They're a little bit worse when the stimuli are random. And here, you might speculate, like, what's going on here? Why are people less congruent in these cases? Our intuition is that for the spatially random stimuli, they're not as consistent in their clustering. So the first time you see the stimulus and you make a clustering, you do a particular clustering. Second time you've got to do a TSP, our proposal is you first do a clustering of it, right? And I think there's more noise in that clustering. It's less likely to be the same as your initial clustering. And so then you get tours which respect that clustering, the second one, but they're now different from the first clustering. That's my speculation. Okay, but we can actually dig a little deeper for evidence here. And so here's a prediction. If people are actually following the cluster structure, when they're inside a cluster connecting the cities in a tour, they should be relatively fast. And when they've got to decide, okay, I'm done with the current cluster, let me bounce to a new cluster to do that subtour, there should be a time cost. The problem, though, is usually that's a larger distance movement, right? Within a cluster, they're sort of spatially close together, all the points. And so when you move across clusters, it's going to take you longer just purely because there's more distance. So what we did was an analysis where we corrected for movement times and said, after you correct for just the difficulty of making a movement, do you see longer times associated when you go between clusters than within a cluster? And it's pretty easy to correct for movement times. We've known for 75 years Fitts' law. Fitts' law tells us that the time to move your hand, for example, to hit a target, increases with the distance you have to move your hand, that's d, and it decreases the larger the width of the target. Take the log of that ratio. And this holds, this is like HCI 101. This holds for all movements that people make, kind of thing. So what we did was, for every movement a person made when making their tour, we Fitts' law. We said, okay, can we predict that movement as a function of the distance they've got to move and the size of the dot? And where our predictions diverge, we looked at those residuals. And the predictions that we'd see large residuals for the movements across clusters and negative ones within a cluster. So let's think about the clustered stimuli. So when you move between clusters, you pay, a 65, 70, whatever, 70 millisecond cost. It takes you longer to move across clusters than within clusters, even controlling for movement times. And that same thing is true for dispersed stimuli, okay? So we interpret this cognitively. That's the standard way to interpret this. This residual tells us that it's harder, not in the movement, we've corrected for that, but in the cognitive process of making those between cluster moves when making a tour, yeah.
This experiment always like the example you showed where they clustered and then immediately did the tours, or was it random? If it is a stable characteristic, you should get the same results even if you do them at different times, because there could be what we're saying, priming effects if you immediately cluster and then tour.
Yeah. It was sort of both. So for a given subject, you were assigned randomly to either cluster first and do tour second, or vice versa. So let's say you were in that first condition. You as a subject would do, your 60 clusterings, Then you would do a distractor task, and then you would see the same stimuli and do 60 TSPs. Never back to back, yeah. Question, Cleo?
I do. Did they ever do like weird stuff within the cluster? Like, oh man, you really kind of messed up when you were in the cluster.
Yeah, we did not allow them to undo moves. So it's possible that they would do that, but we wouldn't track that. But people have shown that in TSP problems, people will follow Gestalt laws of good form, in which you can use that to lead them to make a suboptimal tour, because they just want to extend it in one way, but extending it in that one way makes the rest of the tour less efficient. So there are some interesting local properties that people are sensitive to, or maybe they're just odd, but in our interface, you were not allowed to make to backtrack, so we didn't see. Yeah, good question. Okay, so I think we have in this experiment some pretty good evidence that cluster structure is guiding people's TSP performance. Yeah. Okay. I think in the interest of time, although I've sort of said I'm going to answer your questions later, I'm going to skip this computational experiment comparing people's clusters to k-means clusters and optimal tours. We'll just skip this. And I want to just talk more broadly about these results. So here was our claim. Our claim was that something like a divide and conquer strategy is relevant for TSP. I should say we came up with these claims, and I think the literature did as well, somewhat ignorant of what's being done actually in theoretical computer science to develop smart algorithms to give approximate solutions to TSP. So here is what we know from computer science in a nutshell. So the first useful algorithm for approximating TSP was 1976. And it was guaranteed in polynomial time to give a solution that was within 50% of above optimal. So if the optimal was 100 units in length, it could give you a solution that was no more than 150 units in length. That's pretty terrible, right? That's a pretty terrible upper bound. That was state of the art for 20 years. Okay, that's how hard this was. In the late 90s, a set of methods were developed by Aurora and Mitchell independently to actually get this down to a much better bound. I'll give you that bound in a second. And basically, the way they work is by divide and conquer, a technique called dynamic programming in particular. So imagine you have a stimulus, the dots. Essentially, what it does is it starts partitioning this into grids in this way. And it keeps sub-partitioning until essentially you have points that are well-behaved in any given box. And then it knows how to smartly connect points. And so it does a decomposition, and actually a smart one. It doesn't decompose the whole thing. There's no point in further decomposing that upper right quadrant. To essentially, where the complexity in the problem is, that's where it does the deepest decomposition. That's a hand-wavy explanation of this argument of the algorithms that have come out of Aurora and Mitchell's work. And essentially with these kinds of approaches, I don't know where the picture went, sorry about that. You can get within epsilon percent. You get to pick epsilon, 3%, 2%, whatever. In time, that's this function right here. So still, you can get a good approximation now with these kinds of algorithms. Okay, so divide and conquer is the way to get a good approximation in theoretical computer science. And this is what we think humans are doing. I want to step back a little bit and focus on these four qualities. I said, we think these are the qualities that are there in TSP. Divide and conquer is a good match. But these kinds of properties are there in lots of domains where people solve complex problems, have this quality. So part of my life is spent thinking about mathematical cognition. So I want to give you some examples of these properties, which is not how math cognition folks typically think of math cognition, but they operating in phenomenon math cognition. This will take about 2 or 3 minutes and we'll get out of here, trust me, on time. Okay. I'm going to show you a number of points. I want you to shout out how many points are in the stimulus. Ready, set, go. Okay, good. You got it right? Okay. So if you give this problem, in this case to kids, it's called enumeration, you find an interesting performance curve. So for relatively small arrays, 3 for kids, 4 for adults, it's statistically flat, okay? And after that, And so after that, it climbs linearly with the size of the set. And people have long looked at this kind of curve and said people have two processes. A parallel process, for a small number of items, you could just see the numerosity. Beyond that, you've got to count on. You've got to do this sequential process. Now, this is not the only explanation, but it's a dominant explanation for this kind of performance curves. Okay, here's that stimulus again. What do you think would happen if instead we gave the stimuli in this fashion to people? So your intuition might be, well, maybe you could actually use clustering and hierarchy to simplify this problem. In each case, we have a subitizable number of clusters. Each one has a subitizable number of points. So if you can use clustering and decomposition, you should be faster for these stimuli than for the one on the left. So this is data from a developmental study. So here's kindergartners. How long it takes them as a function of set size for those two sets of stimuli. You see kindergartners are not taking advantage of this structure that's there in the stimulus. But by third grade, the third graders are. They're using, we think, some kind of clustering and decomposition strategy so they can get the subitizing, they can use subitizing for even sets of up to 7. So this is an example that's kind of hidden in the math literature of kids naturally doing decomposition via clustering. Now it'll just be a little more high level. So we see this also in rational number. Rational number is like the hardest thing that kids learn in elementary school. Those of you who have had kids going to elementary school and you're like, why can't you get this fraction stuff? Trust me, your kid's not alone. This is hard. So we often think, let's use manipulatives to teach kids fractions, but manipulatives actually are not always so great. So if you say to a kid, make 1/4 of 1/8, this seems obvious to us how to do it, but a kid doesn't know about rational numbers, so they see natural numbers. Like, okay, there's a 1, there's a 4, there's an 8. I don't know if the 1 and the 4 have this particular relation, so they might draw this kind of solution. Or they might draw this kind of solution. Okay, let me make 2 sets of 4, and let me select one of those sets. And so what you want is kids doing this. And so there's all these great studies in math ed where they show kids materials in the free-form way, and it doesn't help them learn rational numbers. But if you structure the materials for them, you give them the cluster, then they can use their kind of clustering mechanism to understand the mapping to the notation. Let me give you one last example. I'm going to flash 2 point arrays. I want you to tell me which one's got more points in it. You could either say left or the right. Okay, ready, set. Don't be biased by your teammates. What do you think? It is a trick. There's the same number of points. We just knew that because I was a cognitive psychologist, right? It's always going to be a trick. Who said left? Okay, you had the normative behavior. So this is called a regular random. Most of you are irregular. I'm sorry to tell you that. When stimuli are clustered versus in a regular pattern, people judge the numerosity to be less. In the kind of leading hypothesis, there's kind of 2 signals going into your judgment. One is the actual numerosity, which you get there. The other one is something like cluster structure, which you can't turn off. And that cluster process says, you know, there's a lot fewer clusters here than there are points, and both of those inputs go into your judgment system, dragging your judgment down. Okay. And we're not going to get to this. Do VLMs show the same? But they do, but I can't tell you that story. So let me just kind of end here and let you, I want to, like for the graduate students, you see how long this took, 15 years, okay? The manuscript, if it's accepted, is not going to be published till 2027. Sometimes research takes a long time, not this long, but sometimes good problems kind of get stuck in your head, and you pick at them, and you get papers along the way, and they might seem like one-offs or incremental, but they're leading somewhere. And then it takes the right kind of set of circumstances, these 5 individuals, to make things go. And so really, that's kind of the meta story of this talk. So thanks for listening. Happy to take questions now.
I don't mean this probe and you can buy it in, but it seemed, I was expecting a different set of experiments. I was expecting a different set of experiments when you set the initial, at least the natural language version of the algorithm. said that people would identify centroids of clusters.
That was the previous algorithm that people had proposed, yeah.
And that's what the
Experiments were meant to address.
Yeah.
So you had people draw outlines around the clusters, not identify centroids.
That's right, yeah.
And there's two differences. One, they're drawing, and that then changes the visual stimuli as they're drawing it, and you're asking them to define boundaries rather than centroids.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all a long way to say that I thought you would do eye tracking studies of how people just viewed the stimuli to see if their fixation rules tended to hit the centroids of the clusters.
Yeah.
And then if they would go back and use those as the starting points for the local.
Yeah.
Have you considered going for eye tracking studies?
Yeah. So there's a lot there, all good points. So one is, other people propose once you have clusters, you use the centroids. I'm not so committed to that. That's why I didn't go that route. That said, I think eye tracking is critical, right? We have a claim about cluster structure and people being systematic within a cluster, and we have this movement time data, but eye tracking data would be much more relevant to actually getting evidence for the process we're proposing. That being said, I framed it in a way there where it's like, you look at the stimulus, you see the clusters, then you start doing local tours and joining them up. I said multiple steps there. I'm not actually sure that's the way things go. I think it might be more interleaved. I think what eye tracking, that's what I want to use it for, is I think people see the dominant cluster, a cluster, they solve the TSP in there, then they go back to clustering and say, give me the next cluster in the stimulus. Then they solve the TSP. Our clustering paper in Psych Review talks about the properties of an early clustering versus later clustering in a given stimulus. We can see incrementally that people pay attention to different features as they make their way through a stimulus. They don't just do a kind of global, every cluster is roughly the same. And so that's where I would take it from taking, like your question is the leaping off point. I'd like to get eye tracking data that people are actually interleaving clustering and TSP problem solving. I think that's actually what's going on. Then you could engineer stimuli that like got them in trouble, right? Here's a big like salient cluster, but if you start there and I take you in a certain direction, you might really hamstring your ability to get an efficient tour. It's a bit like what the Gestalt, the people that try to build in Gestalt stuff try to get subjects to do, but we could do it much more precisely, I think.
So from what you showed, the best algorithms that we have also do divide and conquer. I'm wondering, first of all, in terms of complexity, and you were saying in the beginning, humans are more efficient when it comes to some size that's smaller than.
That's right, yeah.
So then what is it that separates us from the best algorithms that also do divide and conquer? Are we doing something else?
Right, right. So I think we are. I'm not a vision person, so it pains me to say this, but I think vision's special. Sorry, just a little joke, because most psych departments have this huge contingent of vision people. Let me get back to that. So when I was first presented with this mystery that people are good at TSP, how does a computer get a graph? It doesn't get a visual representation, unless it's a vision language model. I'm not telling you that story. It gets an adjacency matrix, a matrix where every cell says the distance between city N and city M. It's a kind of terrible if I gave that to you as a human and said find the minimal path, you would face plant, right? So I think I think here vision is solving probably a lot of the problem. Whether for me it's giving you a clustering solution which divides it. There's other people have different theories about what vision's doing as a kind of pre-processing step. But I think that's something that conventional algorithms don't have access to. A pre-processing step that does a lot of structuring of the problem. So then you can be in a different part of the algorithm space because you can count on that structuring happening at a low cost. Yeah. I mean, clustering is an NP hard problem too, given a criterion for goodness. So even the thing the visual system does is actually hard for computers. So you can't just say, okay, let's just make computers do that clustering thing on the front end and get an efficient solution. That part's going to blow up if you're a theoretical computer scientist. Yeah.
Yeah, Bill. Hey, I was curious if you're thinking of clustering as clustering like the points that people are seeing instead of visual objects, or the clustering in like the sequence sense that there could be an action path that they're clustering, or there could be like a more focal image that they're clustering over time.
Yes.
That problem.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of trying to hint at. Like we characterize it the first way, which is kind of naive from a vision perspective, like a one shot. You look at the stimulus, you see the clusters, right? But I actually think people are probably more incremental, and I think eye tracking data would show that they saccade to whatever some dense part of the stimulus is. We know the initial clusters people form tend to be denser than the ones they form later, and then they probably then they probably have some local heuristics then to get to the next cluster. But I don't have a theory about incremental clustering, and no one does as far as I know. But I think that's actually a really interesting scientific question. Maybe someone does. I mean, there's the standard 3 or 4 models of visual clustering we went to, but maybe there's a more sophisticated incremental approach, but I don't know about it. In the standard models, they do things like this. Take every point, put a Gaussian on top of it, right? Then blur the Gaussians together, and those give you the clusters. They're still parallel kind of algorithms. Yeah. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts later about incremental approaches. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Dietz. You should have your own as the head of the CMBC.
I'm sure it's on this word that I kind of just had you had sort of started the talk by talking about how the traveling salesperson problem might seem obscure, but it's also very relevant to a lot of things. And I was just not that something actually has to be applicable to be very interesting, but is it like when people are trying to figure out, for instance, just it's extremely non-Euclidean. There was a question about Euclidean, but it has to do where the highways are, how much traffic you can expect, going up the hill across more gap. And like anything on the airlines, it's got nothing to do with how close things are to each other. Are those actually sort of versions of this problem that you could generalize to, or are they different sorts of things?
No, I think they are. Just the cost thing gets measured in not the obvious thing, which is distance on the map in some metric sense, but in time or whatever. I remember I was flying from a city in India to San Francisco. It was going to take me less time than my cousin who was going to have to take the trains just to get to the coast. And I was like, wow, like the travel time and distance on the globe are very different things, right? Like people have not investigated that except for the one study. And again, when you separate points in this non-Euclidean way, people use strategies to try to make it Euclidean. So in that case I gave you of cities, like let's say ringing at the lower elevations of a mountain range and cities on top, what people will do is they'll simplify it by saying, let me treat each kind of set of cities that are high up in a mountain as a local TSP, kind of solve that as if it's on the plane. Do I want to jump down and now do this elevation? So they basically segment it into a set of planes because I can't deal with the complexity when it's that kind of abstract. I don't know if I answered your question, but
yeah, we could talk about it more. I was just curious as to you go from being like visual clustering to some sort of clustering in dimensions.
There's a good example from UPS. So UPS at some point just went away from the purely best approximations because it costs more to take a left turn than a right turn because the driver's got to wait there and there's a higher percentage of getting in an accident. So there it's a case where longer turns make sense because the thing you're trying to objectively maximize is not just time, but it's like money and fuel and things like that. And just not just distance, but time, money, and fuel. That's a kind of non-linear, I think, contribution.
Yeah, and I wish Google Maps knew that.
I had my own retail store for a while. My UPS driver had to drive from Portland to Dunwoody, back to Dorval, and back to Sandy Springs. Crossing the same road. I had 2 questions, but the first one was, when a mathematical model solves a problem very well, is it actually balanced or like correct with the amount of compute it must use, or like a visual representation?
Yeah.
Like if a simpler algorithm can still solve the model correctly. Is there anything like that in any of the studies where they're balancing? They're correcting for the
in the human studies?
In the computer modeling, we have it right here. Yeah. Approximations.
Well, in some sense, this algorithm is nice. You basically can say how much tolerance you're willing, how crappy you're willing to let your solution be, and the time increases you know, in a bad way, but as you demand tighter and tighter, closer and closer optimality, it gets worse.
And that would kind of go linear with the amount of compute it's
probably using.
Actually, more faster than linear. So this really starts, if you want to go from 3% to 2%, it costs a certain amount. To go from 2% to 1%, it gets even costs even more.
Yeah, statistical inference.
Yeah.
Just the other quick one was, you know, when people get older, they can recognize they're more numerate and they can do quarter date real faster. I wonder if that has to do with the amount of representations already built into that person. Say, like in the flash model of the points you put up, if I've played a lot of dice, a lot of dominoes, I can recognize that as the number 5 just by the layout.
So it's a good example. If you show people that play a lot of dice on dominoes, stimuli that have those dot patterns, they basically look like subitizing. So it's pattern recognition. And there's one fMRI study of this that finds that instead of using superior parietal attentional kinds of areas, they actually use ventral visual stream kind of pattern recognition areas. Only one study, so I don't want you to, but your intuition is exactly right. And then if you take the standard dice face and start introducing little bits of spatial noise, they look like subitizers up to a point and then they fall off. Then it's too different from their pattern and they have to resort to the standard techniques. So good intuition.
I was thinking it would leave up, since most people can only, without using numbers, can only understand up to the number 5 or 6. And then it falls off after that. You have to use some sort of pattern recognition.
That's been shown in the cases you just intuited, yeah. On your first point, I think you actually, so you hit upon something interesting. There's like a limited study in AI, what are called anytime algorithms, which are essentially, you let them run, and as you give them more time, the solution they produce gets better and better. I think a lot of cognition has this quality, right? Where we're able to, you know, we might talk about trade-offs or something like that, or explore, exploit. We've got our own ways of thinking about this stuff, but I think that there's a more general principle about people being flexible, about when they know that it's not worth trading more time because they're not going to get that much better solution. But we could talk about that later.
Quick comment. Going back to that question about decomposing the solution, I'm thinking, is the TSP a case of the perfect problem that this holds for, but at other PMI problems like graph coloring, it just can't work? I'm thinking like graph coloring, if you do divide things up, then it might complicate. You actually have requirements that complicate across separators.
Yeah.
That this no longer would hold for.
For this approximation algorithm?
No, not the algorithm. In humans doing divide and conquer just doesn't work.
Yeah, so in classic divide and conquer, each problem's got to be independent,
Yes.
right? It's not quite true for TSP, I don't think. I mean, in our heuristic approach, we're saying let's pretend like it's true to get a human approximate solution, but in general, it doesn't have to be true. But for things, there's a subtlety here. For things like I just wave my hands at matrix multiplication. So if things like dynamic programming can apply, that means it truly is decomposable into independent things. This is not quite that neat. Yeah? So it's always an approximation.